The oddest thing that happened to me was about 3 or 4 years ago. So the record had been out for 22 years, during which time I've grown a beard, aged, put on weight. And I was in San Diego, and a man stopped me in the street and said, "Hey, you are on the cover of Band on the Run." And I said, "Yes, I was," and walked on, and he ran up to me and said, "Who are you?" And he had actually recognized me 22 years later from a bit part on a record cover.
And that conversation probably sums up how much people outside of the UK know about Clement Freud. Yet in England, he wasn't just a guy on the Band on the Run album cover. As a chef, broadcaster, writer, and politician, Clement Freud was in fact a household name and regarded as a national treasure, until he was exposed as a paedophile with a history of child sexual abuse of girls between the 1940s and 1970s. On British television by the ITV Exposure, Abused and Betrayed, a life sentence documentary in 2016. Although he became regarded as quintessentially more English than the English, Freud's home country wasn't England. Clement Freud was born Clemens Raphael Freud in Berlin in 1924 and was the son of Jewish parents Ernst L. Freud, an architect, and Lucy Freud, née Brasch. Clement Freud's family fled the rise of Nazism in 1933 and moved to London. He may have begun as a refugee, but Clement already had a prestigious name of Freud, being the grandson of the famous psychoanalyst and Tavistock Institute and clinic poster boy Sigmund Freud. It's no coincidence that the sculpture of Sigmund Freud is situated in the grounds of the Tavistock Clinic in Hampstead, near Freud's last home in Maresfield Gardens. The Tavistock Institute became known as a major proponent in Britain for psychoanalysis and the psychodynamic theories of Sigmund Freud and his followers. His grandfather's theories and ideas had a significant influence on the Tavistock Clinic and Institute. Clement Freud's grandmother, Martha Bernays, was the aunt of another major influencer, namely Edward Bernays, who was the so-called father of public relations and propaganda, which I think we prefer to call marketing these days. His best-known campaigns include a 1929 effort to promote female smoking by branding cigarettes as feminist torches of freedom, and his work for the United Fruit Company in the 1950s, which was connected with the CIA orchestrated overthrow of the democratically elected Guatemalan government in 1954. While propaganda was commonly thought of as a negative way of manipulating the masses that should be avoided, Bernays believed that it was necessary for the functioning of a society, as otherwise people would be overwhelmed with too many choices. In his own words, modern propaganda is a consistent, enduring effort to create or shape events to influence the relations of the public to an enterprise, idea or group. Clement Freud became a naturalised British subject on September the 4th, 1939, the day after World War II began. During the Second World War, Freud joined the Royal Ulster Rifles and served in the ranks, acting as an aide to Field Marshal Montgomery. The British Eighth Army, led by Montgomery, fought against the Axis forces, and in the Second Battle of El Alamein won a decisive Allied victory in 1942. Freud later worked at the Nuremberg trials, and in 1947 was commissioned as an officer. Also working at the Nuremberg trials was Beatrix Miller, who became the editor of Queen magazine during the 60s that Clement Freud wrote for. After the war, she worked for MI6 in Germany, but rarely spoke about those 2 years of her life. Queen, originally The Queen magazine, was a British society publication established in 1861. In 1958, the magazine was sold to Jocelyn Stevens, who bought it as a present to himself, with a £750,000 inheritance he received from his mother on reaching 25. That's still a lot of money now, but was a small fortune back then. But then his mother Betty was the daughter of a baronet. Stevens dropped the prefix "the" and used the magazine as his vehicle to represent the younger side of the British establishment, sometimes referred to as the Chelsea set, under the editorial direction of Beatrix Miller. Under Jocelyn Stevens and Beatrix Miller's guidance, the fortnightly magazine began to attract a much larger, younger audience and embrace the swinging 60s culture through its fashion, style and content. According to Clement Freud, the magazine Beatrix Miller targeted reader had long hair, was named Caroline, had left school at age 16, was not an intellectual, but she was the sort of person that one ended up in bed with. A statement which now has sinister overtones given Freud's grooming of preteen girls and raping them when they became teenagers. In 1964, Stephen shrewdly became an early investor in Radio Caroline, and the magazine gave birth to the first daytime commercial pirate radio station, serving London. So the illegal pirate radio station that initially came into being to circumvent the record company's control of popular music broadcasting in the United Kingdom and the BBC's radio broadcasting monopoly, wasn't launched by a group of revolutionary counterculture types, but rather a highly privileged blue blood who went on to become the managing director of Express Newspapers, deputy chairman of the Independent Television Commission, and the rector of the Royal College of Art. Clement Freud's post-war training as an apprentice chef at London's Dorchester Hotel would later help him to become an award-winning food and drink writer and arguably one of Britain's first celebrity chefs. After managing a 5-star hotel in France, Freud returned to London and started running the Royal Court Theatre Club, where he gave the then unknown and now convicted sex offender Rolf Harris his first break. Harris compared the Beatles' first Christmas show in December 1963. And like Clement Freud and Jimmy Savile, Rolf Harris was yet another knighted national treasure who had the Beatles in common, plus many other pop stars, celebrities, politicians and royalty. Harris later provided the voice to the interlude tracks, The Painter's Link, and An Architect's Dream on Kate Bush's 2005 comeback album, Ariel, which were later replaced by her son's voice when the album was re-released in 2018, after Harris was found guilty of 12 sexual assault offences in 2014. Clement Freud rose to fame alongside a bloodhound called Henry in a 1960s TV advert for dog food. In addition to being one of Britain's first celebrity chefs, he was also a long-running celebrity panellist on BBC Radio 4's Just a Minute. In June 1973, Freud entered the House of Commons as the new Liberal Member of Parliament for the Isle of Ely. 6 months before he appeared on the cover of Band on the Run, and went on to gain gravitas from serving as a Liberal MP for the next 14 years. Yet Freud was later revealed as just one in a very long list of senior Liberal politicians to be a ruthless sexual predator. Of course, not all sex affairs in Westminster exclusively involve Liberals, but they seem to have played central roles in a disproportionately large number as England's third political party. Freud was praised for his loyalty in standing by his friend Jeremy Thorpe when the Liberal leader became mired in a gay sex scandal involving illicit sex in the Commons, blackmail, a murder plot, and a cold-blooded shooting of a blameless dog. When the scandal broke in 1976, Freud was the only Liberal MP to urge Thorpe to remain as party leader. When downfall became inevitable, it was Freud who helped Thorpe compose his letter of resignation. As Thorpe fell from grace, MP Cyril Smith was abusing young boys in Rochdale care homes and special schools. Claims first surfaced in 1979, and the then leader, David Steele, dismissed them, saying, "All he seems to have done is smacked a few bare bottoms." David Steele, the then leader of the Liberal Party, later became Lord Steele, and Liberal Democrat peer. He eventually admitted believing in 1979 that child abuse allegations against Sir Cyril Smith were true, but did nothing to assess whether he was a continuing risk to children. In fact, David Steele later went on to pass a recommendation that Smith should receive a knighthood in 1988, which was successful. 2020, Steele quit the Lib Dems and withdrew from the Lords after being criticised by an independent inquiry into child sexual abuse for failing to pass on allegations that Smith was a child abuser because it was past history. The Liberal Party seems to attract showbiz personalities and sex abusers. On the 23rd of February 1974, Honor Blackman, best known for her roles in the Avengers TV series and as Pussy Galore in the James Bond movie Goldfinger, lent her support to the Liberal Party as she joined Johnny Savile, older brother of Jimmy Savile, and candidate for Battersea North, on the canvassing tour of the London constituency. Johnny Savile is alleged to have carried out sexual assaults while working at Springfield Hospital in Tooting. The 7 allegations, relating to a period between 1978 and 1980, culminated in Savile, who died in 1998, in being sacked. In his job as the hospital's recreation officer, he held activities for patients such as discos, but he also organised for a local girls' school. The allegations concerning Johnny Savile were uncovered by officers involved in Operation Yewtree. Clement Freud's name was passed to the police Operation Yewtree investigation in 2012, which came into being following the Jimmy Savile revelations. The investigation was led by the Metropolitan Police Service and eventually became a full criminal investigation involving examination of allegations against many people, some of whom were found guilty and convicted, including 70s, 80s glam rock star Gary Glitter, real name Paul Francis Gadd, whose record George Martin produced long before the Beatles were fab, when Glitter went under the name of Paul Raven, and former Radio Caroline DJ Ray Terrett, who was closely associated with Jimmy Savile in the early 1960s, having shared a flat with him and working as Savile's support DJ, assistant and chauffeur. Following ITV Television's 2016 exposure documentary, allegations against Freud were passed on to Operation Hydrant, which was established in 2014 as an overarching national investigation into non-recent child abuse. Its database comprised 2,328 suspects, 298 of whom were dead, and 91 of whom were politicians. After defeat in the 1987 election, Clement Freud was given a knighthood for his services to Parliament. The then Conservative government's hiding in 2016 of the identity of the person who nominated Freud for the knighthood fueled suspicion that concerns had already been raised about his behaviour while a Liberal Member of Parliament. We have a culture of child sexual abuse and cover-ups, and a habit of awarding knighthoods to known paedophiles in my country. Some of whom have been outed. Some were politicians, some were members of the clergy, and others were celebrities and regarded as national treasures. Until revelations of sex abuse hit the headlines. But few were punished. The independent inquiry into child sexual abuse, in its final report, stated in 2020 what most people already knew. Quote, "It is clear that there have been significant failures by Westminster institutions in their dealing with and confrontation of allegations of child sexual abuse. This has included not recognising it, turning a blind eye to it, actively shielding and protecting the perpetrators, and covering up allegations of child sexual abuse." End of quote. Sadly, the inquiry found the main Christian churches in England and Wales proved to be no better. It's little wonder the Conservatives were reluctant to name who nominated Clement Freud for a knighthood, in view of the fact that Freud, Cyril Smith and Jimmy Savile were knighted during Tory leader and Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher's term in office. Thatcher lobbied for her friend to be given a knighthood, despite the repeated warnings of senior civil servants about his suitability for such an honour. The exception here is Rolf Harris, who received his knighthood during Tony Blair's new Labour government's term of office. Clement Freud wasn't just that guy on the Band on the Run cover. There was certainly more to the man who donned convict garb, who hid in plain sight in the spotlight of that photo shoot since 1973. Freud can now be seen as the once-honoured knight who brought darkness to that iconic album cover, when later revelations about his true nature exposed him as a predatory paedophile. Given all that talk among conspiracy theories about the Tavistock Institute's agenda to bring about cultural change via the Beatles, some may think it unsurprising to find the grandson of one of the Institute's prominent supporters on the cover of McCartney's most successful album, and the most celebrated of his post-Beatles works. That said, Clement Freud's presence on the Band on the Run cover is likely to be the only tangible connection between the Tavistock Institute and the Beatles. Unlike the removal of Rolf Harris's voice on Kate Bush's Ariel album, I doubt Clement Freud's image will ever be removed from the Band on the Run cover. But hopefully at least a few more people will be aware of Clement Freud's darker side, having watched this video. In a statement released in response to ITV's 2016 exposure programme, Freud's widow said, "This is a very sad day for me. I was married to Clement for 58 years and loved him dearly. I am shocked, deeply saddened, and profoundly sorry for what has happened to these women. I sincerely hope they will now have some peace. I hope so too.
Clement Freud. Now, I just knew him. You know, he's one of those fellas who goes to receptions and stuff, and he's a funny bloke, you know.